My name is Eric, and this week I violate everything I stand for by going against not one, but two things I said I'd never do again, and make a huge mistake along the way on Spencley Design Co. Let's face it, most outdoor furniture is 100% crap. Everyone either has those terrible plastic chairs that belong next to a keg in a frat house, or owns some junk that Home Depot pawns off year after year that we trick ourselves into thinking actually looks good. One of my viewers reached out asking me to build them a bench for their outdoor fire pit area. And I'll be honest, I initially turned it down until they told me that I could design it however I wanted.
But before we can cut anything, we gotta head to the store and pick up some lumber. Now, this project is gonna be a little bit different than some of the other projects you see me do because I typically buy rough sawn lumber. However, for this project, I'm gonna go to everyone's favorite place to get lumber, and that's the home center. And the reason that I'm going to the big box store to grab lumber is because, one, it's actually gonna be pretty fast and simple, and I wanna make this project easy for you. But two, it's the only place around me that sells cedar, and cedar is what I need for an outdoor wood.
We'll talk more about that later on, but first I need to grab some glue that's appropriate for being outdoors, so this should do. I also need some screws, and back behind this panel saw that mysteriously hasn't worked in the 5 years that I've lived here are these premium cedar boards, which is quite a stretch because I spent about 45 minutes trying to pick through to find ones that were even relatively flat. I don't want to spend any more time in this place than I have to, so let's load up the pickup truck and get back to the shop. Finally back from that interesting trip at the home center, and I picked up 7 of these cedar decking boards. Now, these boards are definitely wider than I'm gonna need for the pieces for this outdoor bench, so I'm gonna rip them in half. After struggling through the first few years of my woodworking journey, always gravitating towards buying my lumber at the big box stores and getting frustrated that my projects never really turned out exactly how I wanted them, I realized the problem wasn't them.
It's me. Hi, I'm the problem, it's me.
I always went into projects thinking that absolutely everything would be perfect. Now, unfortunately, these boards do come from the home center with the rounded edge profile on the sides. So in order for me to be actually able to join all these pieces together, I also need to remove that off the edge. Just like the rounded edges not being exactly what I wanted, I'd go purchase lumber at a big box store and get super frustrated that there were natural discrepancies in lumber and that things were not perfect. I wanted all the wood to be perfectly flat, perfectly dry, perfect in every single way. That's why I told myself that I'm never going to buy lumber from a big box store again. I thought I was only going to be buying expensive hardwood from a reputable sawmill and build things from luxury woods. That was until I had a realization that not every single thing you build needs to be that level of quality. Hear me out. I'm not saying to slap together pieces of junk and charge tons of money for them, but let's be real. No matter what you do to a piece of furniture that's going to be outside, Mother Nature is always going to win. Whew, all right. So now that I have all the pieces milled down to their final width, I can go ahead and start cutting them into individual pieces that are gonna make up the components for the bench. Because nature and the elements is always going to win when it comes to outdoor furniture, things like hairline cracks, slight discoloration, or small amounts of warping is going to happen to them. So using lumber that's maybe less than ideal is fine when a project calls for that. Would I build an entire home out of walnut? No! I'd use regular construction pine lumber. But I probably wouldn't use that same construction lumber to make a dining room table for my home that I wanted to last for generations and generations, showing virtually no signs of wear. That's just not what that material is made for. So is big box store lumber the right choice for every project? Absolutely not. But for an outdoor bench that's going to take tons and tons of abuse, it's more than appropriate, and I admit, I was wrong and I had to change my mind about material selection going forward. Big box stores are a great place to get your lumber for your woodworking projects as long as the project can live up to the potential downsides. No, let's call them characteristics. Big box stores are a great place to get lumber for your woodworking projects as long as the project can live up to the distinct characteristics of the lumber you pick up. What I'm doing here is breaking down pieces of cedar that will make up the sides of my bench. The client sent me a few photos of benches that they were kind of interested in, but wanted me to take a slight deviation from them. She wanted them to be pretty similar to some of these, but with a slight twist. The one that stood out to me the most was this Nelson style outdoor bench. The open slats on the top seem pretty practical since they're drain water, but the one that she liked the most was this one, which I've seen tons of folks copy out of 2x4s. I wanted to make a more angular base, so I kind of drew up this idea here. It's made of two different size pieces nestled together that will make sort of a makeshift finger joint. It should be super strong, and I haven't seen anyone try something like this yet.
As I mentioned earlier on in the video, the side of the bench is going to be made up with two different size pieces. All of these parts that I just cut are going to be for the longer pieces of each side of the bench, and I can use the remaining wood to cut down those smaller pieces.
While I am using a stop block on my miter gauge, the truth is it really doesn't matter how accurate your cuts are on a project like this. With the way that I'm building it, I'm cutting all the pieces long to start out with, and I'll come back later on in the project to bring them down to their final size. And if that doesn't match perfectly what's in the plans, not only will it not really make any difference, but no one will ever know. I did tell you that the plans for this project are available on my website, linked down below, right?
That wasn't too bad to cut all those pieces down, but now I have all of the short pieces for the side in addition to all of the long pieces for the side. And over here, I have some offcuts that are going to make up the seat for the bench, but I do need to bring these down to their final size next. Only problem is that I don't have a miter saw. Well, that's a lie, but no way I'm using that piece of crap. Or a miter saw station to accurately or reliably cut these pieces down, but I want to show you a trick.
What I can do is group all the pieces together that are gonna make up the bench slats together into one big bundle, and using a square to make sure that everything is perfectly in line. Then, with the help of a few clamps, I can gang all of the individual pieces together and act like it's one giant hunk of wood and make one cut, leaving all of my pieces the exact same length. A circular saw would absolutely work here, but I'm much more confident in doing this in my table saw. So I set the miter gauge back to 90 degrees, and then I can use one of my leg pieces to dial in the perfect angle of the blade. Now, this combined piece is definitely heavy, especially with the addition of the clamps, so you'll notice over on the side that I used my tool storage cart to help support things as I made the cut.
And with all the pieces cut down according to those plans, we can now put everything together and make the bench. However, one thing I do want to cover before I start building all this is that you need to make sure that you're using the right adhesive to put these pieces together. Since this is going to be an outdoor project, it's going to get rained on constantly, so it is definitely going to get wet.
Like your mom.
And because it's going to be outdoor, a typical wood glue like this isn't going to be the best choice because it's really not going to hold up to all that water and moisture outside. And since the client needs this bench to last for a long time, I'm going to be using an outdoor waterproof rated glue, but something like epoxy would also work great.
While prepping and cutting all the components for this outdoor bench is definitely more simple and straightforward than probably 99% of the projects that I build on this channel, the assembly is, shall I say, tedious to say the least. You do not want to be shy about the glue usage here. I force as much as I can into the end grain before clamping the pieces together. I find that parallel clamps like the ones I'm using here have a large enough jaw to get good pressure across the joint that's not perfectly 90 degrees, but using an extra scrap piece at the end to help out works great too. Next, it's all basically building up layers of a sandwich. The ingredients in this sandwich are effectively just mayonnaise, which is absolutely disgusting. So I added a little spice, a little seasoning, a little in the form of a few screws popped in there too. And because cedar has a tendency to split, I made sure to pre-drill and countersink some holes before firing in those screws. I quickly discovered that tossing a few clamps on the side of the leg pieces helped ensure that things stayed as much in alignment as possible, since the glue has a tendency to make things slip around. And yes, I know there's already somebody down in the comment section saying, you know, you can use salt on pieces to keep them from sliding. But I don't think anyone actually does that. That's kind of how I feel about doing commissioned pieces of furniture now. Sure, I definitely could go back to marketing myself, trying to make a living building furniture that clients want me to build, but I got so burnt out on that road. I always found myself either building the same thing over and over again, or building things that just didn't excite me. I got into woodworking to get a break from my day job as an engineer, where I really have no creative aspect of my job. For me, woodworking is my creative outlet, and I'm energized by trying new things, whether it be a new technique or just building something that seems extremely challenging. I personally found that really difficult to do when my main focus was building for clients, and that's why I went more towards the content creation side for my business. I get much more enjoyment getting paid to experiment and chase the weird ideas that I have in my head, rather than try to build exactly what someone else wants.
Between buying expensive tools, accessories, and lumber, doing woodworking projects like this can get expensive. I am constantly the person searching around for the best deal, which is why I've been using Rakuten since 2012. Don't believe me? Here's a screenshot. Rakuten is the largest cashback site which partners with over 3,500 of the biggest name brands like Ace Hardware, Lowe's, Walmart, and tons of other brands you already shop with to bring you cashback, coupons, and promo codes, all for free. You just click through the links found on Rakuten and then shop the store's websites like you normally would, or use the browser extension. Even my cat can figure it out. Don't forget to use Rakuten when shopping any upcoming Black Friday or Cyber Monday deals to stack cashback on top of existing deals. To start saving, simply sign up by clicking the link in the description and get a $40 sign-up bonus when you make a qualifying purchase. And huge thanks to Rakuten for sponsoring today's video.
Prior to taking on this project, I set a hard and fast rule that I would no longer build anything for clients, but I feel making concrete rules like that aren't really the best choice. Be open to opportunities that challenge you to think differently, and maybe they'll end up being a good fit. The only reason that I took on this commission was because I had the freedom to build, within reason, whatever I wanted, and I was really fascinated by the idea of creating these finger joints by adding pieces together, rather than cutting them out with a router or dado stack like they traditionally would be done. So, am I gonna turn down every commission that comes my way in the future? No. I think I've learned to be more open to things and explore opportunities as they come. But if someone asked me to build a neon epoxy river table, I'm definitely turning that down. I take that back. If the pay is right, I'd consider it.
All right, so I wanted to interrupt real quick. I'm about halfway through building this bench, and I've noticed a couple things I definitely want to point out. The first one is when it comes to putting these side pieces on, I find that instead of trying to clamp this way and making the pieces kind of slip and slide in the glue, it's actually a lot easier if you take the clamp and clamp it from the side. Using this side clamping technique seems like it holds the pieces in alignment much better and kind of prevents them from sliding all around with the glue. And then the second thing, which isn't an option for me because I don't have one, is instead of relying on those clamps to hold the pieces down while I drive in those screws, I would actually suggest using a brad nailer to very quickly pin these pieces down. I think that'll just make everything a lot easier. So if you are considering making this bench for yourself or maybe a client, consider trying out those tips. Or don't. I'm just trying to help. Let's get back to finishing this thing. If you're enjoying this video and you want to help me get one step closer to being able to quit my day job and take this channel full time, you want to get access to behind the scenes updates that no one else gets, and see all of these videos before they release to the public, in addition to getting free merch, consider checking out my Patreon page. But as always, there's no pressure.
To my surprise, this bench build is actually going pretty fast. However, before you get too in the zone building this thing, you gotta be careful when you get to this step. That's because the only pieces that I have left are the 2 side pieces and then 1 long bench piece. Now, I don't want these screws to be visible on the final piece, so instead of screwing in my last side pieces and top pieces, I'm actually just going to glue and clamp them on. This is something that I definitely almost blew right past, and that would have been a huge bummer. But come to think of it, you could always plug those holes with some wooden dowels or just make the bench, I don't know, maybe another layer thick. There's always ways to fix those things. Another thing I thought of during this whole process was the idea of maybe adding small dabs of CA glue, which is just a fancy name for super glue, between all of the leg pieces. That way the super glue would cure pretty fast and hold things in place while I waited for the screws and wood glue to hold the boards together more permanently. You can also notice at this time that all the legs are not the exact same length. As I mentioned earlier, this is one project where accuracy of cuts honestly doesn't really matter all that much because I can fix it once the bench is totally assembled. That means even if you are pretty new to woodworking, you can pick up these plans and build this project for your own home with ease. And now, thanks to the power of video editing, this glue is completely cured, so let's pop off these clamps and see how this thing looks.
And while I'm doing that, if you want to help support what I'm doing here and pick up a t-shirt or a hat, there's a link to that down in the description below, but again, no pressure.
All right, so the first thing, and should be pretty obvious, is that we need to get all of this glue off of here. Thankfully, cedar is pretty soft, which means sanding everything flat is super easy with some 80 grit sandpaper. And even though it's nowhere near as time consuming as sanding a solid walnut table, I absolutely hate sanding. Which is why I went out and bought one of these Rotex sander things to really plow through material quickly. But sanding is a great time to listen to a woodworking podcast like Off the Cut that I do with my friend Zach from Zach Builds. Every week we talk about all the behind the scenes things we're working on, discuss woodworking topics and trends, and answer all of your questions. If you are looking for something to keep you busy while you're in the shop, consider checking it out on all your favorite streaming services. Just like finding an easy way to sand the underside of the legs, the podcast is easy to find by clicking the link down in the description. So now that I've finished all of the sanding to remove all the glue and really just flatten the outside so they look nice and smooth, you've probably noticed another issue that I need to fix. And that's obviously the sides of the bench. These pieces are nowhere close to being the same length, and I need to cut those down so this sits nice and flat on the ground. And the whole reason that I chose to just cut these pieces long is because trying to stack them up and get them to the exact perfect length is gonna be next to impossible. I would rather just save all of my time and stress and just cut them off later and then they're perfectly at the same length. Now, is doing this a waste of material? Yeah, absolutely it is. I wasted probably 3 to 6 feet of the board by approaching the build in this way, but it makes my life significantly easier. And no, I'm not using my track saw that gets people so upset every time I grab it. I'm just grabbing a cheap circular saw and running it along the straight edge. Boom, perfectly sized legs. Oh, see? Now we've got ourselves an actual bench. And even though it looks like this bench is pretty much done, there is one additional detail I want to add to really make things a lot nicer. All these edges are wicked sharp, and while I definitely could break all the edges by hand, it's a much better use of my time to grab a roundover bit for my router and just zip them off. I started off by buying one of those super cheap router bit sets and was always frustrated by the results that I'd get. I would always get tons of burning and tear out, and it made me just really not want to use my router. That was until someone that you might know, Jonathan Katz-Moses, sent me one of these Astra coated white side bits. They're affordably priced and last forever. So if you're in need of any router bits, I've got a coupon code down below and I promise you will not be disappointed from any of those bits. Now, if you've been watching closely during this whole build, you probably noticed that there's another thing that I need to fix before I ever deliver this to a client. If you look really close, you might be able to tell that the slats on the top are not perfectly flat. That's because this wood had a lot of tension in it, and when I cut it down on the table saw earlier in the video, some of the boards kind of warped out, which is gonna cause these top slats to be uneven. I'll be 100% honest, I was, let's say, not happy and may have said a few curse words when I realized this at first.
Son of a nutcracker!
But after cooling off and getting some suggestions from followers on Instagram, I came up with a simple solution. Whenever I'm building something, I always hang on to all of the offcuts until the project is 100% finished. I had a small stack of cedar offcuts hanging out on the underside of my bench, so I grabbed my crosscut sled to cut down some small pieces. Now, be careful when you're working with small pieces like this. You do not want to get your hands anywhere near the blade, so I use an eraser on a pencil like this to get a good grip. Then I can slap some glue on all these little guys and pop them in between my slats. As I clamp everything up, I made sure everything was perfectly aligned, and boom, that problem was solved. Now I just need to round over all the other slats to make things nice and smooth. So after that detail, we are absolutely in the home stretch for this bench. And you're probably thinking that you could just be done now and deliver it to the client, no problem. However, let's be 100% honest. If you've ever made anything for a client, you know that they're gonna treat your furniture really poorly. They're gonna drag this all over the place outside. And since the cedar is really soft and brittle, and this is end grain, as soon as this gets dragged on something rough, like maybe concrete, it's gonna split all the way down and ruin the bench. And that's why I wanna spend just a little extra time on this one last final detail. That way I can show this detail off to the client to really differentiate myself from anyone else they could have had built this bench for them. Having unique features in the things you build is what's going to set you apart from everyone else. There are also things that you can point out to a client upon delivery that will get them excited and make them happy that they picked you to build their project. What I'm doing here is using some packing tape to wrap the bottom of the legs and create a simple mold. I can then grab some of this Total Boat epoxy, which, by the way, you can get a discount by using the link below and mixing it up. Unlike other epoxies that require complicated math to get the mixing ratio perfectly right, you just use 1 pump of resin and 1 pump of hardener. That's it. Once I mixed it all up, I can then pour about a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch thick layer and clamped on some scraps on the side just to make sure that the tape didn't bend outwards. Once the epoxy cured, I peeled off the tape and you can see how that created a super solid foot, and some of the epoxy actually soaked into the cedar, which will drastically increase the strength and longevity of the bench. Before delivery, I finished sanding everything and cleaned up the epoxy feet before tossing it in the back of the truck. Yes, you absolutely could apply finish to the bench, but I find that to be a losing battle. The client was totally okay with it naturally graying over time, and to my surprise, I was actually happy with something I told myself I'd never do again, which is building furniture for a client and buying lumber from a big box store. But hey, people change. That's all I got. See you on the next one.